Industrialization in particular had a very strong influence on the nature of reforms for public schools and on the organization of a system of public schools in particular. One of the earliest and probably most obvious examples of the impact that industrialization and industrial models had on schooling was the Lancaster system. This is a system that originated in Great Britain, but that also found its way to the United States. It probably will be no surprise that this is a system of schooling intended for poor children, low-income children, not necessarily the children of the wealthy. The reason I say that is because this was a form of education that was very much focused on discipline, passive acceptance of authority, and on a very standardized educational experience. As you can see from the picture, the children are in a lot of very well-organized rows. There's a huge amount of children who are in there, and the instructor is very similar to a manager on a factory floor. So if we revisit the slide, we can, prior to that on industrialization, we can see that there's a lot of similarities between the work floor in a factory and the way that this Lancaster system of schooling was organized. The other part of this is that the learning was very much a rote memorization and a spitting back of facts. Now, on the positive side of things, the industrial impact made it possible to accommodate huge numbers of children in a way that really had never happened before. So there was kind of a payoff. A lot of low-income children may not have ever had access to any kind of schooling had a public system such as this Lancaster or later the common schools come about. And in that sense, it was necessary to have a certain amount of standardization in order to make it very cost effective and widely accessible. So it's important to keep both of those things in mind. So as we move into Horace Mann's reforms and some of his belief systems around public schooling, it's good to revisit this idea of classical liberalism and remember the different components of it, because Horace Mann's reforms are very much tied to a classical liberal worldview, especially a classical liberal perspective of a social reformer. So in order to really understand Horace Mann's reforms, we have to understand that he basically was operating from a strong faith in progress, a faith in reason, but also a sense of entitlement and arrogance that would come from someone who envisions themselves as capable of making decisions for other people, of someone who has the right to intervene in other people's lives and decide for them what is best. So I already kind of got ahead of myself on these slides, but it's just important to remember with Horace Mann that there are a lot of positive things. This idea of a faith in reason, even of the poorest child, the most excluded child, that is important. This idea that you can perfect yourself or progress, improve your situation in life, that's important. However, there's a lot of socializing that is going along with these ideas inside the school, and quite often that socialization is something that is intended to teach a child to better fit themselves into an unequal social order rather than challenge and transform that social order. So Horace Mann had a lot of different areas of concern, so I'm going to just walk through this really quickly. All of this should be in chapter 3, and you can look at that a little more deeply. So he wanted to address issues with the school buildings. The facilities were really shoddy in a lot of places, very uneven. And a big reason why is because it wasn't tax funded at the state level. It relied on local wealth only. So relying on local wealth only is a big formula for inequality. That's something to keep in mind when we get to week 3 and we talk about school finance, because one of the things we see even today is that the more we rely on the local wealth to fund a school, the more unequal that school funding is going to be. And the same held true in the time of Horace Mann. So moral values, we really address this in more detail in that video. So hopefully you've watched that video by this time on the common school. But moral values is basically saying Protestant values. It's embedding a Protestant logic and culture into public schools. Now, Horace Mann was trying to do this in a way that was inclusive in the sense that he was trying to be non-denominational. However, there was still this default to Protestantism that completely excluded anyone who was not a Protestant. So that is something that we still struggle with today as well, where we have this inherited Christian bias that is embedded throughout the institution of education, even as we are supposed to legally have a separation between church and state. So third reform that Horace Mann had was drawing upon the example of Prussian education. Now, this becomes really complicated in the sense that he's looking at the Prussian model and saying they're really efficient, it's really standardized, they're able to meet the needs of way more kids than we currently could. And so he got really excited about that. However, that was also a very early form of tracking and of separating people out toward what later we're going to hear Charles Eliot call their probable destiny. And so what that means is that you give a certain kind of education to a child based on where their family is located, socially, economically, or politically. So a child of a worker is going to get the education that would fit them to be a future worker, like their parent. A child of an elite in the community is going to get a more scholarly, leadership-based education that will take them into a leadership elite role later in life. So obviously, that's very problematic because if you're having a system of education in a democratic society that's supposed to say all people are equal, it doesn't matter. I have faith in reason. Everyone can grow and develop and progress. You're kind of hedging your bets because what you're doing is you're providing people a very narrow pathway, almost foreclosing where they're going to end up. And then you're saying, well, that's what you're most naturally fitted to do. So there's a lot of controversy around that idea, and there's still today a lot of controversy because we still have that same kind of tracking where we steer people toward a particular education based on their economic status and then socially reproduce class inequality. So another big impact that the Prussian model had was by convincing Horace Mann that feminizing the teaching profession would be a great idea. There's a couple different reasons why he thought that would be a great idea. One is it was very cheap. Women could be paid a lot less than men, and since they had less other occupational options, they were more likely to stay in the profession and not have a lot of turnover. So it would be a more stable workforce and a cheaper one. The other thing that's tied to the change in discipline that Horace Mann wanted to incorporate is the stereotype about women in general, this idea that they're more emotional, more nurturing, more fitted to work with children. And so we can see there this idea of being a public mother or a natural caregiver is something that was very ideologically appealing to people when they were saying, why should we have women as teachers? Isn't teaching supposed to be intellectual work? So one of the things we see from this feminization of teaching is that we're subordinating the labor force of teachers. We're also creating a logic where we separate intellectual work from the work of teaching, where we're not saying teachers are developers and creators of knowledge. We're saying they implement and distribute knowledge that other people have created. And that has real implications. It definitely makes teachers easier to replace. It makes them more vulnerable because anyone can, from this logic, what they're saying is anyone can learn a method. Not everyone can develop the information. Obviously, we know there's more to it than that, but the logic here is the same as a worker in a factory. If you do a piecemeal work, if you only put an arm on a chair every day, if you quit, I can find somebody else to put that arm on the chair. If you're this craftsman, this artisan who can make the whole chair from scratch and no one else knows how to do it quite the way you do it, you're much harder to replace and you have a lot more job security. So we see that even today. The more you separate teachers from that intellectual work, the more vulnerable their labor is because it's easier to replace them. And so Horace Mann was kind of thinking along those lines back then, but also tapping into those stereotypes of women as not being intellectual, as being emotional, and using that as a rationale. That ties into discipline because they're at the same time trying to move away from corporal punishment and saying that emotional investment between a child and a teacher is the better way to discipline that child. So to kind of sum up, the business model had a big impact on the common schools in a lot of ways. One is just that standardization. There's a lot of different ways in which common schools were standardized. Standardized in the workforce of teachers, standardized in the treatment of students, in the facilities, in the textbooks, everything. Also the common school played a big role in labor regulation. Um, we can see that in the feminization of teaching and the exploitation of teacher labor. We can see that in the standardization of curricula and that socialization of workers through the curricula into an industrial morality. We can see it in terms of teaching students a passive submission to authority rather than a more critical, self-determining curriculum that would allow them to make a systemic analysis of inequality. And especially for workers, that becomes very important if you deny them that kind of an education.